Entertainment. As we've been discussing, universities like University of Michigan have been cracking down on student protesters. In April, U of M fired a full-time employee and suspended 4 from campus jobs for participating in pro-Palestine protests the previous year. Locally, a number of students are pushing back against university charges. In June, a group filed a lawsuit against Wayne State University, claiming the school violated the group's constitutional right to protest in 2024. So how should universities treat student protesters? What rules should they have? And what are the principles they need to be defending? Frederick Lawrence is the secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Society and a distinguished lecturer at Georgetown Law School. He's also the former president of Brandeis University and regularly consults university presidents. He spoke with producer Sam Corey about how they should be handling the moment and future protests.
So there are 2 core priorities for universities, as you've stated them: free expression and safety. And you've noted that those things have to go together, but that safety needs to support free expression, not the opposite. Why?
Universities exist for a reason. They exist for the purpose of creating knowledge, discovering knowledge, transmitting that knowledge through our teaching and through our scholarship. In order to do those things, you need a robust system of free expression and a robust system of academic freedom to support the academic enterprise. Obviously, none of that is possible if students, faculty, staff, for that matter, don't feel physically safe. So it's essential that we have safety on campus. But that's not the core function of the university. It has to be safe in order to support its core function, and that is the creation of knowledge, the discovery of knowledge, and the transmission of that knowledge.
And in other words, you can only do that with free expression. You can only seek new knowledge. You can only innovate. You can only come up with new ideas if you're allowing for free expression. And of course, if people don't feel safe to do that, then you won't have that either.
And the 2 pieces fit hand in glove that way. People have to feel comfortable asking questions that they don't know the answer to, trying out ideas that may not be the best ideas. Often as not, someone will try out an idea in a seminar, and you can see it in their face that as they say it, they're not sure they think it's true. And sometimes I'll say to them, keep going. It's okay. Let's try this out. And as often as not, it wasn't a great idea. And we debate it and we figure out what the flaws in it were. Sometimes we see the strengths in it, and not infrequently, somebody else in the room says, I don't think I agree with the way you said it, but it prompts me to think the following thing. And then we go in a much more productive direction. The point is, if all of that is censored, if all of that is stopped up, then that process of creation and that process of discovery gets kept from taking place.
We're talking about student protest and free expression from students. What are the protocols that universities use or should be using when working with students and making sure that they do have freedom of speech, but also that students are safe moving around campus?
The first rule has to be that all understand that we start with a presumption in favor of free expression. We're not neutral on expression, sort of balancing out whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. We start with a presumption of free expression. I think that's important for everyone to understand, first of all, for the speaker to understand that there's a presumption that what I'm going to say is going to be protected by the institution, and for the listener, and sometimes the unhappy listener, to say, well, we're actually starting with a presumption against that person having a right to speak. So that's our starting point. But then what are the limits on that? Where does that begin to run out? Say there are 2 main areas where you have incitement of imminent lawless activity, where you have actual physical threats, threatening behavior. That certainly is not permitted on campus. Not permitted anyplace else in society, by the way, but it's certainly not permitted on campus. In addition, you cannot have undue disruption of the operations of the university. So what are some good examples of that? A protest in front of the library, that will be protected. A loud protest in front of the library that actually interrupts the library being able to do what it's doing, you might have to move it someplace where it's a more appropriate expression. Occupying the library, keeping people from getting in, that's not permitted because the university is allowed to function as an institution, not just for the speaker, but for everybody else, the listener and those who have no interest in this particular conversation. So the 2 things to focus on are actual threats, not permitted, incitement of violence, not permitted on the one hand, and undue interference with the operations of the university, on the other hand, not permitted.
You talked about incitement, and I know that this is something that Justice Louis Brandeis used to speak about. And of course, you were the former president of Brandeis. Part of the point, I guess, of protests and of student protests a lot of times is they are trying to incite to a certain degree. They're trying to get people's attention because they're trying to draw attention towards a certain cause. Where does it cross the line in terms of incitement? Is it simply, bullying other students and threatening them? Is it in part of the language that they use? Like, where is the line on incitement?
You're right to bring up Justice Brandeis, who said that it's incitement of imminent lawless activity. And actually, the Brandeis quote is that in the absence of incitement of imminent lawless activity, the answer to bad speech is not enforced silence, it's more speech. So what does it mean to be involved in incitement of imminent lawless activity? It does not mean something that challenges somebody's views. It doesn't even mean something that upsets someone, but literally threatening another individual in a way that the person reasonably and rationally feels unsafe, not uncomfortable, not perplexed, but unsafe. Are these lines hard to draw? Sometimes they're hard to draw. It's surprising how often these lines are not hard to draw. So, for example, chanting a particular slogan as a student walks past a demonstration on the way into a building might very well be that student will feel very uncomfortable. I might feel uncomfortable, depending on the slogan, but that's not threatening somebody. Actually intimidating an individual. You go into this building, the following thing is going to happen to you. That kind of language, that could be considered a threat.
I guess I'm wondering what matters in terms of the slogan, right? A lot of people really don't like the slogan, globalize the Intifada. A number of Jewish students think that that's open season on Jews. How do universities draw the line on these things?
One of the ways you draw the line is by asking what was it that the speaker was actually intending to accomplish. It's understandable that people will look at the results of speech or the way in which your speech is received by some, usually not all, but some members of the community. The problem with that is that it creates what the law referred to as the heckler's veto, where the heckler gets to say that because this upsets me, you don't get to speak. The answer has to be that individuals are entitled to feel safe, physically safe, not necessarily intellectually safe. So you will sometimes hear things that will be very disturbing. I mean, I can tell you in the years since October 7th, when I visited many campuses, and before I speak on a campus about free expression, I always would walk around the campus to try to get a feel for what the sense of the campus is, what the culture of the campus is. And if there was an encampment back in those days in the fall of 23 and the spring of 24, I'd always walk through the encampment before I would talk about free expression. Most of the time, in fact, every time I can think of now, and I look back on it, there were signs that had things that I might have disagreed with. These were certainly students who were, some of them, longer on passion than they were on information. But I can genuinely say I never felt threatened walking through there, and I don't think other students felt threatened. On campuses where students felt threatened, then the campus often had to take action, and it often did. But on most of the campuses where I would say there was disturbing content, but not threatening.
Is there a specific example where you think it was legitimate that students were threatened and like the student protesters needed to step down or they needed to be removed from the area where they were?
It's always hard to tell from a distance because you don't know what was actually happening on the ground. But let me not talk about a particular campus, but describe the kind of allegations. Allegations that students were actually literally stopped from going into a building, stopped from going to class, stopped from walking across campus. Not in a situation where in order to walk across this quad you had to listen to something, but a group of students actually intimidated someone and kept them from walking across campus. It's perfectly appropriate there for campus security to step in. No student should have to fear for his or her actual safety walking across a campus. And the campus actually has an obligation to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, again, it comes down to physical safety, because if you protect too much against intellectual safety, what you're doing is curbing free speech, free ideas, the advocacy of certain perspectives. It is essentially stifling what universities are supposed to be doing.
I think that's exactly right. And I think if you wade into these conversations long enough, you have people on multiple sides of multiple issues who wind up feeling that way. And this is where you get into the problem of I don't want to have to listen to that, but somebody else should have to listen to my view, which is equally upsetting to them. It is very hard to hear views that are personally very upsetting. It is exactly the purpose of a university to create a context where we listen to each other, where we hear each other, where we learn to listen to each other respectfully. The goal of a university is not for everybody to talk to each other until we agree. We'd have to avoid a whole series of subjects if we said that. There are certain subjects on which we're not going to agree, but we have to be able to disagree without delegitimizing each other. You listen to another person, you say, I disagree with that position for the following 5 reasons. That's fine. But you can't say that person doesn't belong here, doesn't get to stay on this campus. That's delegitimization. Universities can't exist in a context of delegitimization.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET Detroit Public Radio. I'm producer Sam Corey speaking with Professor Frederick Lawrence, the former president of Brandeis University, about how universities should be conducting themselves when student protests erupt on campus. You've talked a lot about the importance of language in other interviews, of making students feel like they're a part of the university and a part of the solution to maintaining peace and maintaining the ability to express themselves freely on campus. Can you talk about that importance of language that administration uses when referring to students?
Part of what administrations have to do is to understand that they have an important role to play in between speech being validated, supported on the one hand, and speech being prohibited on the other. Let's take some specific examples and ones that are a little hard to talk about. If you go back a few years, the white supremacist Richard Spencer wanted to speak on many university campuses. Now, some university campuses banned him from speaking for their own reasons. But what many campuses did, and I think it was a much better approach, was to say that if he's invited, have him, which is to say it's protected speech. We're not going to shut it down. It's not prohibited speech. But that's not the end of the story. Then the university has something to say about that. So good examples would be places like the University of Florida, in which the president at the time made a statement that said, if Richard Spencer comes on campus and says the things that he said in the past, those things are antithetical to the values of this university. He has the right to say them, but we have the right to respond, and I, as the university president, have the right to respond. The other thing, by the way, that the university did was to set up a parallel event for other people to go to. There's a First Amendment right to speak on a state university campus. There's no First Amendment right to have anybody show up and listen to you. And so part of what the university can also do is signal that although a group wants to invite this person and he wants to speak, that we, the university, think there are better ways of spending your time, and we're going to try to encourage you to spend your time.
In other words, the university can make their statement clear, their point, their perspective clear about where they stand on the views of someone, but they're not going to either remove them from the campus or, importantly, shout them down. They're not going to allow other students to shout down someone who they disagree with.
That's right. You certainly can have what we call content-neutral rules about how speeches go forward. So that could be where it could take place, what hour it could take place. You could even have a rule that says that no one from outside the community is allowed to speak on campus unless invited by somebody inside the community. The complicated part of these kinds of context-neutral rules, you've got to really make sure that they're context-neutral, because sometimes people get themselves in trouble by articulating what they thought was a neutral rule, turns out not to be. So campuses that said there's a rule against having encampments here sometimes found out that, in fact, that students were more than permitted to sleep out on campus. I went to a small liberal arts college in New England where sleeping outside on campus in sleeping bags was sort of one of the things you got to do over the course of your 4 years. You and a couple of friends would take some sleeping bags out and sleep in the quad or go up Stonehill and sleep up there. So if you're going to say no encampments, you better understand that that's the rule that applies all across the board.
And they have to be really clear. Is that right? They have to be made very, very clear to students so students know where the university lands.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that happened in the immediate aftermath of October 7th was that many universities were, in fact, caught off guard by the events. And to a certain extent, the whole world was caught off guard by the severity of the horrors of October 7th. But many universities were caught off guard by how to respond to, for example, things like encampments. And so there was this feeling of rules being made up as they went along, and students understandably were complaining that this didn't used to be a rule. It's all of a sudden a rule about this particular kind of expression, and it's never been applied before. Now, there's nothing wrong with the university learning as it goes and says this is something on which we have to have a policy, but the policy has to be clear and it has to be consistent and it has to be content neutral. The other piece I would add to this, though, because I do think that universities, by and large, by the fall of 2024, got that part right. The rules were pretty clear and the rules were pretty content neutral. And they're pretty well articulated. But the rules shouldn't just come out of thin air. The rules should relate to the mission of the university. So to a certain extent, on some campuses, there was almost too many clear rules in the fall of 2024. You can chalk up to this point, but not up to that point. You can demonstrate here up to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but not after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a clear rule, but why would you want to have that rule? So you've got to always go back to the mission of the institution. How does this advance the mission of the institution? The mission of the institution is not for it to be quiet. The mission of the institution is not for it to stay out of the newspapers. Believe me, as a former university president, I know the desire to stay out of the newspapers. But the mission of the university is to create knowledge and to disseminate that knowledge and discover that knowledge, through teaching, scholarship, debate on campus.
Always move from a place of first principles.
Move from a place of first principles, and that's why when I do, for example, Board of Trustee retreats and meet with trustees, I will always say to them, here we are in this lovely conference room on this very peaceful day, sandwiches and coffee and water here for us, and we're very calm, and put your hand on your wrist for a second, your pulse rate is normal. This is a good time to come up with the neutral principles. Because when it comes time to apply them, it's not going to feel like that. Your pulse is going to be very high. You're not going to have a lot of time to make a decision. There are a lot of people from the outside who do not mean well for the university who are watching you make this decision. And when that happens, you have to be able to come back to this moment of clarity when it was calm and say, this is what we stand for.
I want to stay on policies for a second. After the pro-Palestinian protests have erupted, after October 7th, as you noted, a lot of protocols and a lot of policies have changed at universities. Does this concern you?
It doesn't concern me so long as the policies are consistent and are applied regardless of which side of this or any other issue is involved. And it doesn't concern me, again, if it can be connected back to the mission of the institution.
What are university presidents, university leaders telling you about the moment that they're in and the job that they're in?
Many of them, and these are people of overwhelming good faith who are dedicated to the higher education mission in the United States and have dedicated their careers first as teachers and scholars and now as administrators to making these institutions thrive and flourish. I think many of them are finding the challenges now very difficult, very debilitating. There's a sense of public distrust that they're dealing with. There's a sense in many cases of government distrust that they're dealing with. And I think the sense is not that these jobs of running universities was ever supposed to be easy, but it's supposed to be hard for the right reasons, but not the idea that your citizenry or your government is attacking you. I'm not characterizing what people have said. I'm just quoting what people have said. The Vice President of the United States described colleges and universities as the enemy in this country.
What we need more than inspiration is we need wisdom. And there was a wisdom in what Richard Nixon said approximately 40, 50 years ago. He said, and I quote, "The professors are the enemy." We have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country.
Certainly, universities have done things that I haven't agreed with. I'm sure they've done things that most people haven't agreed with. But the notion that colleges and universities are the enemy, to me, is antithetical from the whole model that is let this country thrive and play the role it has as a world leader. It is our higher education sector, going back to our founding days, that has trained young people, that has been the engine of social mobility, that has discovered scientific, social scientific, and humanistic knowledge and distributed that knowledge. Has it made mistakes? Of course it's made mistakes. Are there ways in which universities are overdue for a course correction? Absolutely. But the starting point ought to be that our higher education system is one of the jewels in the American crown. And I think many university presidents now feel that is anything but what they feel.
There is a concern among some scholars of the dying or the fraying of classical liberalism. Essentially, openness, curiosity, the willingness to tolerate different beliefs. There's concern about this from the political right, but there's also concern about it coming from the political left too. Do you worry about this?
I do. I think that the Academy it should, even in this moment, maybe especially in this moment, should take this opportunity for self-reflection. I teach a seminar at Georgetown Law on free speech on campus. We just focus on that. And I always start by saying, we're not just going to talk about it, we're going to do it. You're actually going to hear lots of different views that you don't share. And I know that for some of my progressive students, it is upsetting to them to hear some of what their most conservative colleagues say and vice versa. I have them write reaction papers every other week or so, each student. Every year you hear through those reaction papers, not I've changed my mind, although you hear that too. But even more important is I understand that position better than I used to. I used to just think there was nothing to that position. That was the position of insert here your condemnatory name for what you think the other side is. And then it's just being in the classroom, listening. You hear that I understand that position more. I still don't endorse it, but I understand it better. And then with some frequency, you get the, I really thought X before I came into this, and now I really think maybe it really is Y.
This makes me really think about not just what people are saying and the differences that people are saying and the exposure to that makes them uncomfortable, but how it's being said. I think a lot about social media and how outrage is pushed up essentially because that gets more attention. And so there's a divisiveness that the social media platforms, a lot of them like only for the sake of it drawing attention. How much do you think about that? Not just what people are saying and it being agitating or infuriating, but how it's said and where. There's also, I should say, the anonymity aspect of this and not actually engaging with people, which it seems like what you're offering in your classroom is an actual engagement that looks different than how it looks on X or on Facebook.
I want to be very careful about blaming everything on social media because that's become sort of the standard explanation for if it's bad now and it used to be better before and it must be because of social media. That said, I also don't want to miss the impact of this. There's a particular New York Times opinion writer who tells the story of early on in his career, he used to read the emails that would be sent to him. He'd stop reading them because it just got to be so threatening and upsetting. We wasn't getting any information from them, and he was getting angina from it, and so that's not going to help anything. But he did say on one occasion when he was reading them, he decided to write back to somebody. And he wrote back to this really pointed name-calling kind of message. You're an idiot. How could any fool write this? Why did the New York Times pay you to do this? So he wrote back, and what came back in response was this very lovely, leavened kind of message of, "Dear Mr. Smith," his name is not Smith, obviously, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were going to read this. No, of course I don't really think that. I enjoy your columns. I disagree with you." It's an entirely different conversation. So it never occurred to this person when they wrote something and then hit send that a human being was on the other side of it. And I will say in class that, of course, there is a kind of class discussion that would not be permitted. You can't scream at anyone. You can't threaten anyone in class. I've taught for over 35 years. I can tell you that has happened 0 times in any of my classes. Here's something that has happened in some of my classes, not where somebody threatened somebody, not where I thought it had to be corrected in the moment, but there was a kind of language that was deprecating in a way that was really unhelpful for all concerned. And then what I will do after class is make a point of talking both to the person to whom the comments were addressed and the person who made the comments. And I'll tell the person who made the comments, you're not allowed to do that. I'm saying you're not going to dock your grade for doing it. You're not going to be punished for doing it. This is a different conversation. This is me as your instructor talking to you about what kind of person do you want to be? Do you think that's an effective way of persuading this person? Why did you talk like that in class? I'm not going to tell you that every single time has led to somebody having an epiphany moment, but sometimes it has.
Your solution is respecting people, is dignifying them, and then it is playing to their higher ideals and hoping that they make the right decision.
I wrote a little piece some years back on what I called the 3 rules of vigorous civility. The idea of calling it vigorous civility was designed to sound like an oxymoron, but it wasn't, right? There's nothing that's not vigorous about civil conversation, and there's nothing that's uncivil about vigorous conversation. I think we excuse serious conversation as if I'm challenging your ideas by being obnoxious or calling you names. That's not more vigorous. It's just rude, more rude. So the 3 rules of vigorous civility, one I alluded to earlier, that we disagree without delegitimizing. When you disagree with someone, actually paradoxically, that's community building. Because to disagree with somebody, you have to listen to them. You have to understand what they say. And then you join issue with them and you say, well, you disagree. And you hope they hear you and you've agreed that you've heard them. Doesn't mean you agree at the end, but you've actually built a community of conversation. Whereas when you delegitimize, that's community destroying. That's where you say you have no place at this table, you have no place on this campus, you have no place in this society. The second rule, which is related but slightly different, is that when we engage in difficult conversations, we begin by questioning each other's ideas, not each other's motives. Too easy to question somebody's motives. Then you don't have to engage with their ideas. And the third, which in some ways sounds like the simplest, but is in fact the most important, is to begin difficult conversations with a forced expression of shared ideas. Now, I will sometimes tell students who disagree about something vigorously, and I'll say, look, I'm going to let you disagree. I promise. I really will. But before I do that, I want you to put together a joint list of 5 things on which you agree. And by that, I do not mean motherhood apple pie. I mean like real things that are relevant to this issue, hard things that you agree on.
Why? Why do that?
First of all, it amazes them to see that they actually do, because they've gotten so used to rushing to what they disagree on. And also, when you start the conversation by seeing what you agree on, it never fails. You find more things you agree on. The sheer humanity of the conversation weighs out. Yeah, look, you want the best example of this in American politics? It's going to surprise you when I tell you.
Sure. Yeah, I want it.
Go on to YouTube and download the Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960. If you listen to what they say, they talk to each other so respectfully. Oh, Senator Kennedy's correct about that. Or Vice President Nixon makes a very important point there.
The things that Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with. There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position. There is no question but that this nation cannot stand still because we are in a deadly competition, a competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking. We're ahead in this competition, as Senator Kennedy, I think, has implied. But when you're in a race, the only way to stay ahead is to move ahead. And I subscribe completely to the spirit that Senator Kennedy has expressed tonight, the spirit that the United States should move ahead. Where then do we disagree?
We would never do that today. We just assume you would never hear that. Something very precious has been lost when we lose the ability to do that. Nixon and Kennedy disagreed on a lot of things. They were very, very different people and very, very different candidates. But they also understood that they were part of a joint enterprise, both running for president of the United States. I think what will make debates different in public life is when the public says, that's not acceptable to me. That name calling is not acceptable to me. I want to hear the ideas. What would make the public feel that way? I think if they were inculcated in a very different way of discussing it. Why do you accept in your candidates what you would not accept in your own children?
But part of the problem is holding people accountable is not just yelling at the person who's doing the name calling. It's, again, it's doing what you're doing, which is respecting, dignifying, and then hoping they get to their higher ideals, trying to push them towards higher ideals.
I don't know if that's the best approach. I just believe it's the only approach. I'm sure on the other side of God's heaven, there may be a better approach. But on this side of God's heaven that we call our world, I think it's the only approach that is going to work. And the idea of punishing our way into understanding each other is never going to work. Of course, there are cases on university campuses where people have to be punished. That goes back to what you were asking me earlier about what are the limits of free expression. So if somebody actually threatens another student, if somebody defaces property, destroys property, if somebody makes it impossible for the university to operate, of course, that's sanctionable behavior. But the vast majority of things we're talking about is not that. The vast majority of things we're talking about are ways in which people are behaving where they might be educated. Isn't that what we do? They might be educated into a better way of communicating and expressing their views.
That was producer Sam Corey speaking with Frederick Lawrence, the secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Society, a distinguished lecturer at Georgetown Law and the former president of Brandeis University. Up on the Metro, from fiber to flame, painting to protest, Hot Damn is not just a show. It's the sound of a creative institution finding its fire again. That's next here on the Metro. This is WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Stay with us.